Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. This is part 2 of a 4-part series on cultural memory and commemoration. Throughout the series, we're looking at the phenomenon of cultural memory or collective memory and investigating ways in which groups narrate their own histories. Tonight, we'll continue with that thread, but expand outward to the way communal groups publicly commemorate people and events that are important to their identities. So please let me introduce my guests for this segment. I'm very happy to have you with us, Glenn Ehrstine, an associate professor in the UI Department of German and International Studies. Good to have you here. And next to him is Roberta Marvin, the director of the University of Iowa's Opera Studies Forum and former associate dean of international programs. So thanks for being here, both of you, on this chilly night. I think you are the perfect people to talk about this topic. Glenn, you've spent years studying a centuries-long tradition, the Passion play performed at Oberammergau, and a religious and theatrical tradition we're going to spend some time talking about. And Roberta is a classical music scholar and a specialist on the music of Verdi. I'm anxious to hear your insights on the cultural impact music and musical masters can have on societies, a century after their deaths. And Verdi's a good example of that, I think. So I'd like to start with you, Glenn. Could you just describe to us what the medieval Passion play is and what importance it has held traditionally for Christians?
That's a large topic.
Yeah.
My work is predominantly in medieval theater, so both Passion plays, religious theater in general, and also carnival plays performed during Mardi Gras, which is very, at times, unchristian, or certainly bawdy. So Oberammergau is in many ways an exception or a contemporary excursion for me. I'm fascinated by this as a living tradition that technically, it has medieval roots. It's technically not a medieval tradition per se in that the Passion play is founded in the 17th century. It's really Baroque in its origins, but it harks back to earlier versions of religious theater performed in Germany. One of the original play texts, or one of the bases for the play, is a surviving play text from Augsburg from the 15th century. And what really fascinates me in the context of our topic on commemoration tonight is that how the play itself, to some degree, it's no longer just about commemorating Christ's crucifixion, act of salvation, if you will, which really is at the heart of the Passion plays. The question is how best to, when Christ sort of charges his followers with the act of commemoration in breaking bread, taking communion. There are questions as to how to appropriately represent that act, and this is where opinions diverge. If Passion plays no longer survive, it's because, among other things, Martin Luther and Protestants in general frowned on enactment and particularly impersonation of Christ as an appropriate way to commemorate that act. And yet, in Oberammergau, in deepest, darkest Bavaria, if you will, this tradition continues, and it takes on dimensions now where it's not just about commemorating Christ's act of salvation, but it's really about celebrating the community and living up to, not just living up to this vow that was taken after the plague came and visited Oberammergau. This is supposedly the origins of the play, where the community, once they took the vow, there were no longer any deaths that came about because of the plague in the community. You can actually go back into the historical record and show that actually, indeed, there seemed to have been some deaths that occurred after this vow was taken, but nonetheless, this is a way of sort of celebrating community and perpetuating this tradition in a devotional context, not necessarily primarily a commercial context, but of course, the success of the Passion play as a really a huge cultural event has funded a sort of communal recreation center, a spa for the village inhabitants, et cetera, et cetera. So there's certainly some commercial success behind this as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I was reading a little bit about it, and various generations have approached it somewhat differently. I know there's been discussion of the representation of Jews in the Passion Play, and a lot of discussion about that, what it means, and
right.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that controversy.
If you will, the inherent problem of performing passion plays has to do, from a contemporary perspective, that depending on how you read the Gospels, the perpetrators in the death of Christ were certainly Caiaphas and the Jewish High Council at the time. You can simply take that as these are individual actors. Certainly in the late Middle Ages, these actors were the members of the Jewish community were seen as a group that was responsible for Christ's death. And so there are all sorts of actually rather vile anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish components to medieval passion plays. You have accusations at the time of ritual host desecration and ritual murder, which themselves often find their way into the theatrical tradition. You have a Croxton play of the Sacrament from England. You have the mystery of the Holy Host in French. And so you sort of have Semitism built into the Passion Play tradition. And this is something that the members of the Oberammergau community had been wrestling with for quite some time. In a post-war context, this was something that they did not necessarily object to or were happy to gloss over. Certainly in the 20s and before that, but then it's no accident that Adolf Hitler actually comes and visits Oberammergau for the, I believe it's the 1933 performance, which they shifted a little bit, or 1934, which would have been a special anniversary for the performance.
So it continues now. It's 2014. It's not done every year, is it? It's every 10 years?
Every 10
8
years, yeah. And they moved, at some point, they started it in 1634, and then at some point they moved it to a 10-year cycle. So it happened in 2010. I was actually able to visit with the generous support of the Stanley Foundation and international programs. I was very grateful for that. And again, it's just sort of an odd juxtaposition to see what is ostensibly a medieval tradition continuing to be performed, and quite successfully as well.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, it's now quite a sort of a business venture too. The whole community takes part.
And perhaps continuing with the topic of anti-Jewish elements in the play, certainly in the contemporary context, the community is well aware of these issues, even following Vatican II for the 1970 performance and moving forward. The Catholic Church itself was working towards ecumenical ends and took issue with elements of the play text and consciously pushed the rather conservative community to work towards some reform of the play text. That charge has actually then been taken up and embraced enthusiastically by a younger generation of performers. For the 1990 performance, the youngest director of the play in the play's history was elected. The city council or village council has to more or less approve the main the director, the music composer, all elements of the performance really are approved by the city council. And they elected Christian Stückel, who was something like 25, in his 20s at the time. He was the youngest director in the history of the play. And he worked actively to reconfigure the portrayal of Christ, eliminating anti-Jewish elements and actually trying to restore what was really the original Passover meal that was celebrated by Christ and his disciples during the Last Supper. So you actually get Hebrew prayers spoken on stage.
So as an historian, are you surprised that this still continues as it does?
Part of me is, yes, quite a bit. I find it engages interesting questions of, one, the perception of the Middle Ages, ideas of authenticity, what is authentic. I mentioned that the community does not, the community makes plenty of money on the play, although they spend a lot of money on the play as well. So one of the controversial decisions of this young playwright was that he wanted to completely upgrade the costumes and the set design, et cetera. He brought in for the 2000 performance Robert Wilson to design some additional performance pieces and artwork that was sort of supplemental to the actual play itself. And he spares no expense for the expense of the play. They bring in authentic materials from Israel. They actually took the cast on a trip to the Holy Land and Israel to actually kind of get them prepared for their roles. So there's constant dispute over how much money should be spent on the play, and some of the more conservative members of the community are not thrilled that there's this young, somewhat progressive director who wants to take the play in new directions.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for starting us off with that. And now I want to flip over to you, Roberta, and talk a little bit about Verdi and his influence musically and also culturally in Italy and beyond. But we've just celebrated the 200th anniversary.
We have. We are just coming off of 2013, and that was a year that saw the bicentenary celebrations for the birth of Giuseppe Verdi and also for Richard Wagner. And if you have managed to stay in the limelight for 200 years, you get your very own encyclopedia. The Wagner Encyclopedia, which is hot off the press, and the Verdi Encyclopedia. So the other composer whose anniversary we celebrated in 2013 was Benjamin Britten. He was born in 1913. So he doesn't have his own encyclopedia yet because it's only 100 years. But I think that this idea of composer anniversaries really gives us all an opportunity to reflect on just what Joan's asking about. And since I know more about Verdi, I will tell you about him. It will come as no surprise to those of you who are opera buffs that Verdi really is and always has been since 1842 in his first really successful opera, a very important part of Italian culture. And people tend to remember him for various reasons. He was not only a great composer, but he was quite a philanthropist. And many of you may have seen the movie that came out that Dustin Hoffman directed, which was based on one of Verdi's philanthropic activities. It was called Quartet, but it's based on the idea of the home that he built for retired musicians called the Casa di Riposo. It was also the subject of another film called Tosca's Kiss that came out several years back in the 80s. He also built another hospital in the province where he lived. He's also known for his professional activities, for supporting the musicians of his day, and some of the reforms that he enacted, both in terms of educating musicians and in terms of theater conditions, employment conditions, still are in effect today. And he's also known for his political activities, and this has given us quite a bit to talk about in recent years. Many people feel that his operas were very much a banner for the liberation of Italy from Austrian domination, as well as important to the cause of unification and independence for Italy in the 1860s. Other scholars say no, that this was just part of the culture of the time. So there's quite a bit going on with that these days. But Verdi is so very much a part of the culture still today. I think it's not surprising. He became pretty much the dominant composer by the time he died in 1901. When he died, it was really a media event, or so we would consider it that way today. He front page headlines, La morte di Giuseppe Verdi, in all of the major newspapers in Italy. And for his funeral in the city of Milan, 300,000 people showed up on the streets. So that just gives you some idea of how he pervaded the society. He still does today. Whereas every city in the United States may have a main street, every city or town in Italy has a Via Verdi, a Verdi street. So this is just how ingrained he is in the culture. One of the interesting blogs that one of my colleagues wrote for the Verdi bicentenary questioned whether we really needed to celebrate this. Because composer anniversaries are important milestones for the reception of composers' works. Well, Verdi's are still in the repertory. They're performed all the time, all over the world, every major opera house and every minor opera house. And we can have Verdi at our beck and call, DVDs and CDs. So we can remember Verdi whenever we wish to remember Verdi. Mm-hmm. Yet the institutionalization of these commemorations seems to be something that's important. Both in terms of Wagner and of Verdi this year, there were hundreds and hundreds of performances. There were exhibitions, there were conferences. More for Wagner than for Verdi. And the reason for that is that in 2001, we commemorated the centenary of Verdi's death. And that was when everyone went all out, because we knew we had the chance, and it seemed to be the time at the turn of the millennium to really do something. So we kind of lost our energy, and by the time 2013 came around, we had already done so much. But for Wagner, and certainly for Britain, there's been a number of things. I visited one website recently where they listed just for January to July of 2014, now that we're in a year after, 450 events worldwide for Britain during a 6-month period in the year after the centenary. So these composers become very important, I think, in terms of that. But it occurred to me as I was thinking about this program tonight that in a way, because of music, we're remembering, we're commemorating composers all the time just by performing their works, which is very different, I think, from certain other kinds of activities that happen. So.
Right. But then the other part of our title tonight, this cultural memory idea, that Verdi connected to the Italian cultural memory is still very, I mean, that's still real.
Still very, very real, both for elite culture and for mass culture.
Yeah.
Verdi's music is used in every possible way. It may sound cliche, but you can walk the streets of an Italian city, Venice is the one that comes to mind, and you will hear people singing in their windows when they're open. And quite often you will hear a Verdi melody coming out of there. It was a surprise to me. I had no idea that it pervaded quite that much.
Excuse me for interrupting, but have you seen the Woody Allen film, Rome in Love? I've forgotten what it is, but the Woody Allen film, that his most recent one before Blue Jasmine, is actually, it picks up on this theme of an average guy singing Verdi and going big place. And you also mentioned Toscanini and some things that happened around World War I.
Right. I have a book coming out this spring called The Politics of Verdi's Cantica. And this is actually the title that he gave to a work that we know better in English as Hymn of the Nations, or Inno delle Nazioni in Italian. It's a work that, it's not an operatic work, but it's a work that has served a very, very important purpose in the 20th century and in the 19th century, in terms of bridging chronological periods, bridging American and Italian culture, keeping this idea of the Italian historical memory very much in the forefront during World War II. This is a work that Verdi was commissioned to compose in 1862 for the London International Exhibition. There was to be a concert with great composers from Western European nations, and he was asked to compose this particular piece. It's a cantata. And There was a huge scandal surrounding it. It was not performed. It was rejected by the people who commissioned it, because he handed it in late, and because he didn't write in the genre that they asked him to write in. They wanted him to write a march, kind of a stupid thing to ask an opera composer to do. And he wanted to write a texted piece, so he did. This piece was seen at the time to represent the newly unified and independent Italy. 1862, Italy achieves its independence in 1861, and it was very, very important for Italy to be seen in the international arena. So the piece kind of caused an international scandal when people heard that this great Italian composer and Italy had had the music rejected. The piece did get performed, but then kind of fell into oblivion. In 1915, Toscanini resurrected it during World War I for a large concert in the Arena in Milan, and used it along with several of other Verdi's works, excerpts from operas, to make political statements. Where it really gained some power in terms of cultural memory was in World War II. Toscanini was known for his concerts for the Russian cause, to play great Austrian and German masters, to let people know that, look, there's good music, there's good stuff coming out of here, and for giving voice to his Italian compatriots. So he took this piece and he used it, building on the memory of what was known at the time about when Verdi had composed it, and used it in a broadcast that was sent all over the world through National Broadcasting Company, for a concert in January 1943. This got so much attention, both in the United States and in Italy and in other countries, that the Office of War Information approached Toscanini and said, will you make a film for us using this piece so that we can broadcast it in Italy and say, look at what a wonderful country we are. All of these Italian people, we support them. We bring you, Toscanini, here, and you have success. We are friendly to Italy. We're doing the right kinds of things here for the people who need us to help them. The interesting thing about this particular piece is that Verdi intended none of this, but what the media does when they get in on this during World War II is they build it into this enormously powerful piece that has these connotations for 1862, when Italians were just free of oppression, and 1943, when they were fighting to be free of that oppression. And the rhetoric and the narrative that surrounds this piece is nothing short of amazing. But the real important thing, I think, in terms of cultural memory and what that actually means, is that it's building very much on history as it was remembered in 1943, not necessarily history as it happened. And I think that's a very important thing. I was listening to the previous segment from last week, and the idea of memory and forgetting, this idea of selective memory, or memory that has been kind of formed by what people want you to believe, by the mediators, the historians, the biographers, the journalists, the other commentators who do that. And so Toscanini, as an equally important cultural hero for Italy in the 20th century, taking Verdi and then making him into a modern kind of cultural patriot, if you will, for an important cause.
Yeah.
So you've got multiple layers, I think, in terms of both the commemoration and the cultural memory going on.
Yeah, fascinating. Do you have any concluding things you might like to say?
Well, I also wanted to pick up on the topic of forgetting, which we discussed in the previous segment, and just mention that Ober Ammergau is within Germany, even within Catholic Germany, unusual in perpetuating this tradition. Certainly wherever the Reformation took hold and in Protestant regions throughout Germany, all of these towns had some form of Catholic theater in the late Middle Ages. And I have personally encountered, working on various different traditions, For example, in the small town of Kunzelzau, which is in the northeastern part of Baden-Württemberg, you can actually show that a reliquary cross with a piece of the assumed piece of the true cross was displayed in place of the crucifixion, and yet you still had actors in costume portraying Christ, sort of surrounding this in a procession through the town, the use of space, guilds performing there as well. And yet, because this town is now fairly conservatively Lutheran, no one really wants to talk about this. And it's not, I mean, it's one of a kind. It would, in some ways, put this town on a map, at least for a handful of scholars. But this is not something that the town necessarily is comfortable with. And you have similar issues regarding efforts to put on a passion play in Worms, which is actually also a Protestant community. And they're also justifiably concerned about what they might be recreating in re-performing a passion play like that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. Roberta Marvin and Glenn Ehrstine, thanks for being with us. I want to say thank you also to those of you who joined us here this afternoon, and I hope you'll join us next week when we'll be discussing cultural memory and commemoration as related to the Third Reich and the Holocaust. WorldCanvass programming is available on UITV, on YouTube, iTunes, KRUI, and the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. I'm Joan Kjaer. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.